Africom is, in part at least, the product of a bitter turf war which defined the early years of the Bush administration. A war fought between the US State Department, which officially runs the United States international relations, and the Department of Defense in the Pentagon. The soldiers won that struggle. And under Secretary of Defense Donald Rumsfeld, the Pentagon drove American foreign, military, and development policy across the world. Larry Wilkerson, a career soldier, became Secretary of State Colin Powell's Chief of Staff under George Bush.
To find a voice that equals or exceeds the voice of the Pentagon is virtually impossible. How do you put $30 billion, chump change, up against $750 billion? That $750 billion attracts to it every congressman, every senator, every major military contractor from Halliburton to Lockheed. You have an enormous constituency for war. You have an enormous constituency for the instruments of war. What constituency in America does the State Department have? None. Zero.
So the Bush years were defined by the ascendancy of the Pentagon and its neoconservative cheerleaders. But what was their agenda, and how did it lead to the creation of Africom? One clue to that is to be found behind the windows of an office in Washington known as the Old Executive Building. As soon as President George W. Bush was installed in the White House just round the corner, his Vice President Dick Cheney came to this building behind me to convene a series of secret meetings with oil company executives.
That was so closely guarded that even people, I'm not even sure my boss, Secretary Powell, knew exactly what kind of conversations took place there. Here's what my educated surmise is, that among other things, they discussed tipping points, they discussed the scarcity, growing scarcity of non-renewable fossil fuels. I think out of that came this concept, strategic concept, that we better be doing something to get our hands on or get control of or influence over a substantial amount of oil in the world so that we can ensure our economic future. Indeed, ensure the American way of life.
It became known as the Energy Security Panic and was to define the foreign policy initiatives of the Bush administration. But then, something happened which added a whole new urgency to the debate. Boom! The horrifying attack on the Twin Towers in 2001 brought death to the United States on a scale familiar elsewhere, but utterly new to the US. And what President Bush called the global war on terror was born. A war on an ill-defined international conspiracy of jihadists, mostly operating under the Al-Qaeda label. That war formed a critical mass with the US's oil security fears. And suddenly, Africa, a continent which had been increasingly slipping off the Americans' radar, began to look more important.
Dick Cheney saw America's war as a war with Islam, and subsequently we were going to have difficult relationships with countries in the Middle East that were supplying an enormous amount of our oil. So President Bush, after 9/11, announced that we needed to get 75% of the oil that we were getting from the Middle East from Africa.
Did it represent a significant shift in American foreign policy?
It created an interest in Africa that had not been there before.
And with China and even Russia increasingly active in the continent, Africa began to exercise some of the most influential right-wing thinkers of the time. The Heritage Foundation, housed in this imposing-looking building behind me, is arguably the foremost conservative think tank in American politics, and it was the intellectual powerhouse behind the Bush administration. In October 2003, they produced this document, U.S. Military Assistance for Africa. In it, it argues for increased efforts to coordinate security measures with African countries at risk from terrorism. And the best way to do that, they argued, was for the creation of a dedicated military command for Africa. In essence, they were arguing for Africom. And they were clear why that was needed. Africa has
vast natural and mineral resources.
And, said the report,
America must not be afraid to employ its forces decisively when vital national interests are threatened.
But where does that stand with the rhetoric of stability, freedom and partnership, which is Africom's professed purpose?
What was the motivation for Iraq and the invasion in March of 2003 as opposed to the rhetoric, if not the same thing? Democracy, freedom. What were we really in Iraq for? It's clear to me what we're in Iraq for. I worked in the Pentagon as assistant to Chairman Powell when he was working for Secretary of Defense Dick Cheney. He is the ultimate realpolitiker. He is the ultimate realist with a hyper-nationalist twist. Dick Cheney did not go to Iraq to end terrorism. Dick Cheney went to Iraq to gain access to the second largest known oil reserves in the world.
But that was then, of course, and this is now. A new dawn, a new administration, and a president whose own roots lie as deeply in Africa as in the United States of America. So will Africom be different under Obama? Can the US overcome its past mistakes in this continent? Well, perhaps there is a lesson in Rwanda, because today Rwanda and the US have one of the closest military and diplomatic alliances on the continent, and not that long ago that would have seemed impossible. On April the 7th, 1994, Africa's first genocide of the 20th century began. In the space of just 100 days, 1/7 of the population of Rwanda, mostly Tutsis and moderate Hutus, were massacred. As many as 1 million people died. In the grounds of this church alone, around 5,000 people sought sanctuary. They all perished, men, women and children, hacked and clubbed to death in a terrifying frenzy of violence. Today, their clothes and bones lie here in remembrance.
At the time of the genocide, I was 14 years old.
You're 14? Eugenie, a Tutsi from the capital Kigali, watched her family die.
So, as we Tutsis, also we tried to hide. So we used the schools, we used the churches, we used the bushes, so that we can have protection.
And what happened to your family during the genocide?
I lost my 2 parents, 4 sisters, and 1 brother. I saw with my eyes killing my mother. Yeah. I'm with her when they killed them that time.
I'm so sorry.
That's how it is.
For 3 months, the killings continued, and despite desperate pleas for help, the UN, the West, and most prominently the self-proclaimed leader of the free world, the United States, failed to act. They even refused to call it genocide. It really isn't going too far to say that had the United States government intervened during the genocide in Rwanda, the tens, possibly hundreds of thousands of people who died under the most horrific circumstances would still be alive today.
Basically, I think they were indifferent. There is the cynical side. What are we getting out of that country anyway? What does it produce? It's a tiny country with a lot of poor people who are hacking each other. I think since there's no resources in there, there's nothing really worth fighting for, dying for. If some of the troops have to die, then why not leave it, simmer itself out and perhaps hope for the best.
But it didn't simmer out. In the end, the genocide was effectively brought to an end by the Rwanda Patriotic Front, a rebel force consisting largely of young Tutsi men and women who had themselves been refugees from earlier ethnic violence. Today, those rebels have become the official army of Rwanda, But despite the US's inaction during the genocide, they are now bound to the US in one of the closest military alliances on the continent. The question is why?
Ladies and gentlemen, General Ward.
Well, this is where a curious difference in presentation arises. The Americans are keen to stress the buzzwords, partnership, and the need to build stability and security in the area.
We indeed are a committed partner, doing things that will help promote stability and security in the region, on the continent, and by so doing, that stability is felt around the world.
The Rwandans are more upfront. They have no illusions about why the United States wants to be their friend.
We are not naive to believe that the United States doesn't have economic interests in the region. Rwanda does not have a lot to offer in terms of economic incentives, but Rwanda has a lot to offer in terms of its position in this area.
So it's a deal. Rwanda gets health and military training from Africom, and the US gets a loyal ally in a country whose neighbors, most notably the Congo, are dangerously unstable but rich in the resources and minerals which the United States of America needs. One way of looking at this is that in '94, at the height of the genocide, America had no interest in Rwanda, and therefore it didn't act. Now, America does have economic interests and security interests, and now it's a friend of Rwanda.
And that's the way the world works. I think that you cannot dwell too much on the past if there are, strategic interests for both partners. America also might be killing two birds with one stone by appearing to its citizens to be caring about Rwanda, while at the same time they are taking care of their strategic interests, such as the minerals and in the neighborhood and so on.
The problem is, African armies can have agendas. The US is training and supporting an army which is integral to the ruling Tutsi-dominated party of Rwanda. It is a party which has made considerable progress in terms of truth and reconciliation and development. But press freedom is restricted. There are serious questions about the conduct of the 2003 elections, and opposition figures can find themselves removed, arrested, or accused of fostering divisionism or genocide ideology. So should the US be training this government's army?
There are many armies in Africa that have been associated with national liberation struggles. And it is important that those armies evolve from guerrilla armies into professional armies, subservient to civilian, constitutional, and democratic authority, just as it is in the United States.
But in Rwanda, the army serves a government accused of undermining democracy. So where does that leave Africom and US policy?